I'm going to ask a couple of questions which I'd like reactions to from the speakers. But it is also an opportunity for the audience to ask a question or two. We don't have very long, but there seem to be two underlying themes here, which we could just touch on. And I'd like each of you to make a quick comment about it. The first is, and it's a very obvious one, the influence of the site and the landscape, the shape of the land, the way you use that in informing the new buildings and work with it and enhance it. So that's one thing which I suspect is common to each of the projects. The other thing is about transmission of cultural values. Now, I was thinking about this particularly with the Enkanaza Maasai scheme and the Sydney University scheme, that both of them are very sophisticated ways of transferring knowledge. Now, in the West, we load it with all sorts of other values and we tend to call it education. And that's what universities and schools do. But in a traditional community like the Maasai, they don't necessarily, I mean, they may go to school, but the traditional way of imparting knowledge would be through practice, through custom, through imitation of their family, their elders, and there would be a way of transmitting knowledge which would be quite different to sitting in a lecture room being lectured to. And I wonder if each of you could say something about that, because I think in opera, it's about trying to show how this very sophisticated art form, deriving from a very long history of Chinese culture, is being brought up to date in a modern expanding city like Wuhan. So can I ask each of you for short comments on that?
Can I start with the Maasai project? Like you say, the passing of culture, in our case, in the Maasai's case, is from generation to generation in a verbal and practical way. For example, the youngsters and kids, Maasai children, they can only choose to go to big schools for Islamic culture or Christian culture or education. So they are kind of hold back from their own Maasai education. Very small example is that the youngsters do not recognize the smells, the footprints, the presence of animals surrounding their homes. So there's some killings by animals because they just do not get educated anymore. So that's such a very small but lethal, lesson in life, how to get your culture passed through the young generations. It's amazing if you think about that. And it's not about quarterly figures. It's daily survival. It's a 24-hour schedule instead of looking forward for a year.
Sure. And in Sydney, I mean, you're obviously dealing with something quite different there, which is using a Western educational model of the university, but to enhance the opportunities in the lives and indeed the cultural memories and continuation of the indigenous people.
Yeah, I think importantly, the idea of knowledge exchange was pivotal to unlocking the potential of the project. And so in the context here, while it's located in Sydney, it needs to give expression and understanding that Indigenous culture in the Australian context is not monolithic. There's over 270 distinct language groups, 600 dialects. The student cohort are coming from across this island nation and continent who may never have been in a plane, never been in a lift, never engaged with some of the rhythms of an urban context and major metropolis. So creating a culturally safe environment where you're enveloped by culture as the normative experience becomes the pivotal way to utilise architecture as a mechanism to engage with culture as part of the experience of that educational environment, including supporting ceremonial practice, understanding the different modes of living, creating a bespoke solution rather than a sort of a Western lens of a sort of standardised approach. So it's very much nuanced to some of those cultural needs.
Yeah. And how about in opera in China? I mean, obviously you're working with different media, and I'm sorry, I'm very ignorant. Wouldn't know the difference between Han opera and Peking opera. But I guess each of them have slightly different protocols and performance conventions.
Absolutely, yeah. The project is about celebrating the thousands years of Chinese history. Chinese culture is extremely rich, it's extremely vast, but not very well known. Its artistic forms, I mean, in the West, but also not in China. So we wanted to create a project. It's a massive project, first of all, huge building, that one celebrates these thousands years of history in the form of the craft itself, like putting it in its proper place, but also taking those visual cues and kind of design elements that emerge in the design itself. Yeah. But then second, solving the urban problems that were present in the site.
Yeah. And in Auckland, perhaps you could build on using the site there, and it's obviously a ravishing site, and Auckland often scores very highly in the list of most livable cities, I think. But how does that work in the sense you're creating, again, I suppose, a largely Western model of the stadium to enhance indigenous culture?
Yeah, I think the first thing is what we've really pushed in working with our cultural experts is how to make not a Western model of a stadium.
Yeah.
And how to so the cultural events that are happening there, they've got an entrance of we'll say the local population from one side, and then in the Haka coming from the other side. The visitor is important. Yeah. And so we need to host at least 10,000 people coming from either side. So all of a sudden the shape of the landscape starts being evolved around the experience that has to be created so that they're able to continue the traditions. One thing that happened since this presentation was submitted, so it wasn't shown today, is we've been able to take the train station, which has a historic significance, and really turn the front door of the stadium to be to the train station. And so this great archway train station that's from the early 1900s, finding ways to really push as the main gateway and access into the stadium is something that is really going to change the perception as you come into this district. So it's no longer about something that's foreign, it's something that you're coming through the history to truly the procession into the stadium.
And I suppose given the narrative that, the train station would obviously be a Western model.
Yes.
But showing that there's a longer history to New Zealand than, the history of Western settlement, which is 200 and something years old only. So this is fascinating, and I think the way, particularly again going back to China, the sort of semi-outdoor covered spaces were working with the idea of landscape and landscape forms. And bringing them into the building. Again, what I suspect what each of you are doing in different ways is to reflect local traditions, local customs within the context of a 21st century building, which is probably built with Western technology, or a lot of it will be, Western engineering standards and all those sorts of things.
But I think the interesting part about that is you start thinking about these outdoor rooms that you're creating and how they become theirs.
Yeah.
So the outdoor room is just sculpted as a space to bound, a place to gather.
Yeah.
But it really becomes about the people that are in the space that really enhance it, that brings it to life. It's really about the people in the spaces and less about the space that you're creating.
And I think each of them is also about bringing together people from different communities as well. They may be focusing, particularly in Encarnazo, on one particular community, one particular culture, but it doesn't seem to me to be excluding any other. It's about actually making it available to the world in a rather grand sense.
Especially if you think of opera stadiums. I mean, they're traditionally built as exclusive places.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
Almost like fortresses.
Yeah, exactly.
But something that's common in all four of these projects actually is this idea of porosity. Like whether it's macro scale or micro scale, these buildings are breathable and accessible.
And I suppose a slightly naughty question, but do any of you feel that what you've seen from the other presenters might inform the way you think about your projects, either the one you've discussed or ongoing projects?
Sorry. No, I think what was really strong with all four presentations, I think all the design team here approached the opportunity without any preconceived ideas about what it should look like or what should eventuate. So coming into these projects and leaving any preconceived ideas about how things should work, I think it's a strength in all of the presentations of the four today. So I think the opportunity that we have is to take some of our technological know-how, because buildings have to function in a particular way, but allowing the story and the narrative in a local context to actually drive the outcome. So what we were, and I think all the schemes today, what we were able to achieve was something that's really distinct of place, that this stadium would look ridiculous in any other part of New Zealand, let alone any other part of the world. And I think that would be true for all of today's projects.
And I think you put your finger on a really important point, which is that each of these respects something that is, as it were, pre-Western architecture. And you're working with that and making a form of contemporary architecture around it, but it's not defined by the traditions of the Beaux-Arts or the Bauhaus or Le Corbusier or something like that, which I think is a very interesting opening up of architecture, which is what we're trying to do with this WAFX program. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to, yeah, and we have to make the presentations of the trophies. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation.